Hello, hello, hello. It's your good friend Wild Philosopher here again with
Wild Rose.
Wild Rose, Ryan Rose.
Ryan
Right.
Rose, yes.
Yes, and today we will be talking all about vampires. Everyone's favorite discussion. So we'll be going into what is a vampire, how widespread is the belief, what are some quintessential features of a vampire attack. But first, we will be starting off with a brief methodological discussion on, on what types of sources do we use. I know this maybe isn't the most interesting discussion, although it's okay because at present time we have 0 viewers, so I don't have to worry about frightening anyone off by being too boring. um, but very important because I can give you a bunch of information on vampires in the folklore, vampire beliefs, their sort of relation to literature, but much of that, well, I can't give you all the info. That would be hundreds and hundreds of hours, right? And also, if I give you the methodology, you can then extrapolate to a whole bunch of other instances. Whereas if I just give you the info, you're just stuck guessing, like, is this guy right or is he wrong? And you don't know, like, where's he getting this from, and how's he evaluating his info? So without further ado, we are going to start by explaining. So when we look at vampires in folklore, we're not looking at literature. We're looking at folkloric accounts first and foremost, and we can divide these folkloric accounts into 2 categories, Sagan and Marchen. Now, the characteristic element of a Marchen is what we call in English fairy tales, legends. They're accounts that were never. They might be valuable to a community. They might explain deep truths about the world, but they are not intended to be taken historically or as connoting as a literal series of events. Cinderella is undoubtedly the best known Marchen and quite possibly the oldest. Its internal markers indicate it's certainly Proto-Indo-European and could very well be older depending on what we count as variants. Beauty and the Beast, another Marchen. And then there's Sagan. Now, the Sagan is distinguished from the Marchen because it is meant to be historical. It is meant to describe something that happened in real life. Right. The Sagan are sometimes, okay, they're not necessarily identical with, but they're very similar to what we call memorits, which is the term used in folklore for, or folkloristics, excuse me, for a, as I said, ostensible, and I'm adding in the ostensibly, so academics like us, real encounters with vampires or trolls or whatever, which have been remembered by the community and passed down throughout history. Or in many cases, won't even be passed down because a lot of memorits are told by the person who experienced it. It can be captured in real time nowadays. Memorit meant to be real. Its internal features all list real locations and people. It often is an actual supernatural experience. Let's be very clear here. We can debate its reality all we want as far as the creatures are concerned, but everyone reporting the supernatural as lying is no longer quite in vogue academically because of its necessarily absurd and illogical implications. Most Marchen were once Sagan. So most fairy tales were once putative descriptions of real events that were then adapted later on. Those of you who are in your middle to later age have seen this yourself with the transition of a lot of UFO encounters into into legend, and then the third step from that, which is the development of a vast purely fictional literature. So you start off with people think they're encountering aliens. We can lay the reality aside for the moment. It gets adapted into legends, and then from there, somebody decides to make the X-Files. I don't know if you wanted to add anything about Sagan versus Marchen, Ryan.
I think that was an accurate summary.
Mm-hmm.
I guess as an example, one of a famous Grimm fairy tale, actually, the Pied Piper, is a good example of this process of the Sagan, the memorit, right, the experience transitioning into Marchen or into the fairy tale formula. Because the Pied Piper story did actually happen. It was, I think, in the 13th century. Was it 14th?
I think 13th.
13th, yeah. And it was, in fact, outside of that German village. There was a man who did walk into the village, and the I think inscriptions dating near to that time, as well as window panes that were commissioned to commemorate the event, do accurately describe a man wearing this, colorful getup. He walks into the village. He then leaves with all the children, and they're never seen again as he disappears into a mound. Now, scholars have kind of been befuddled by this event because of its seemingly, uh, historic nature, despite the fact that its contents are utterly bizarre. And so there have been various discussions and debates surrounding, the heart of the event, the truth behind the myth, so to speak, or really what went on. Uh, so the famous Grimm's fairy tale has the example of, the Pied Piper. He comes to play. He comes to get rid of the rats, but his payment is refused. So then he takes the children instead, and they all go live happily ever after. Uh, in the original, well, maybe not happily ever after. It is a Grimm fairy tale after all. But uh, in contrast to that, Grimm, or into the finalized form, it was developed over centuries. The original event does not contain any mention of the rats, but what it does contain is just the children. Like over 200 children disappeared, very bizarrely.
So he just
And
comes and steals the kids.
yeah, he just steals the kids.
Yeah.
There's no rat that was added later, so you can actually see in real time how the fairy tale formula develops. There are things that are, added later. That they are, it's an accretion of data, or of just different objects or entities in the story. But we do have the original tale, so to speak, and that was an event. And scholars have debated. Well, maybe it was a children's crusade, a failed one, that is. Although they somehow doubt the existence of the original Children's Crusade, so I guess that's up for debate. It was a repopulation immigration program. It was
Basically everything except for a multicolored man stealing 200 kids with a flute.
yeah, yeah, yes,
That's
everything except that. What else? What are some other? It's a metaphor for the plague or death,
yes.
which begs the question why the adults didn't die. Um, why just the children? As well as he was a, a serial killer or a kid lover in a not so good way. Among it varies. It varies.
Yeah.
Um, you can debate it all you want, but it did happen. Um, Although some think it was just a conspiracy to cover up something, and it didn't happen at all, and whatever.
Yeah.
Regardless, that's a good example of the saga into Martian transition,
Yeah.
among numerous other examples.
Well, yeah. The other another excellent one is Euthymus of Locry's notorious battle against an undead and vampiric Greek hero.
Okay.
The first attestation of that is a rock wall relief dating to within 50 years of his death. Um, because of the relief was so detailed, most of the details of the story remained consistent. But sometime around the first century, it gets added in that he was wearing a woman's dress at the time, because they were trying to explain why the vampire was able to mistake him for the woman they were trying to sacrifice. Uh, in his case, of course, academics just deny his existence. Just like the town of Locry wanted to make up a powerful boxer slash demigod, so they just invented this guy, and then they made up a story about how he turned into a god after violently defeating a revenant in hand-to-hand combat for the love of a beautiful lady. But yeah, that's another good, reasonably good example where starts out as a memorite and then transforms over the space of about 500 years into a semi-legendary piece of folklore.
Yes, and I do want to take the time here to point out that in contrast, or to how we normally think legends develop, it's some fairly mundane event, and then it becomes wilder as it passes through different hands. I would argue that it's in fact the, let's say, inherently bizarre or supernatural, seemingly supernatural elements of the story that actually give it its staying power. And I
Yeah,
think that's actually what feeds into the legend was its originally supernatural uh, nature.
yeah. Li Hui makes the same point about Chinese mythology and folklore. That the euhemerist theory is almost always backwards. It was weird supernatural events, and then people they couldn't rationalize it. They're like, because they're like, obviously this can't possibly have happened. So they added in an explanation, like the rats, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, they added, and then became progressively more rationalized, and often ended up becoming history. Funnily enough, um, because figures who were basically like powerful spirits would eventually become uh, like mortal men.
yeah.
So, yeah, reverse euhemerism often tends to be more accurate. Uh, so as I said, we have our accounts. We will be focusing primarily on Sagan and then buttressing them with Marchen as needs be. We will not really be drawing on literature because it tends to be authors tend not to care about their sources, and they tend to just modify them at will. Um, they're not necessarily useless, but I certainly put them much lower on the scale, especially when it comes to supernatural folklore, where people think they have a right to just rewrite stuff at will because they're describing things that don't really exist. Um, but you also see this with all sorts of other stuff where people are like, well, I don't like this peasantry custom, so I'm going to design some frivolous adjunct to it. A lot of George Eliot stuff did that. Famous Victorian novelist, sorry. So yeah, we will be focusing on the Sagan, and we will be focusing specifically on the features of the accounts. So you saw this on our last stream when we were talking about we were talking about Hyperborea, when we focused on the precise features of the accounts. And then we also examined interpretations, and we looked at how they intersect or diverge. This includes the interpretations of the people who bore witness to the event in question, because people will often bring their own presuppositions, right?
Yep.
Martin Luther's encounter with a house spirit is a very good example of this. So to be clear, this is the founder of Lutheranism, not the I Have a Dream black man. Martin Luther, in his Table Talk, describes a house spirit that lived behind the stove and was tired of one of the cooking assist servants chucking dirty water right beside where people cooked food. So it kept playing mean tricks on him and eventually hung him from the rafters in an attempt to get him to stop putting dirty water right beside where people are eating or cooking food, and keeping food. Martin Luther concludes from this that therefore the power of the devil is circumscribed or is incapable of killing pious Christians. The more rational interpretation would be that murder was a grossly disproportionate response to kitchen unsanitary conditions. Especially, and the features of the house spirit encounter here are very consistent with the features elsewhere, where there is no demonic layer of interpretation posed on top. So you can see we can look past. In terms of sources, most of our sources are academic, but we're not really going in favor of academic. We're more going in favor of sources that have a reasonably good way of handling, vetting, and using information. We could talk about scholarly character, trustworthy, or charitable, and consistent. So I'm not having to deal with weird throw-in theories. Nothing sensational, none of that, and then none of the weird, today we're going to look at gender and vampire encounter stuff. We are not using Wikipedia. Don't use Wikipedia. It's absolute garbage. I will list books where appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That's good.
Anything else you want to bring up, Ryan, or can we launch right into this?
I think we can go right in.
Beautiful. So before touching on vampires, we actually need to provide some explanation of what I'm going to pick. There's dozens of different terms for this, from tonal, which is nothing to do with music tone. It's a Nahuatl word, to double. We will be using double throughout this to connote the, what would you call it? Okay, so people tend to conflate the guardian spirit with the secondary soul, as they call it in shamanic practice.
Mm-hmm.
We were focusing on the double as the shamanic soul rather than the guardian spirit. I will denote that differently. Sorry.
All right.
The double is it's a consistent feature of supernatural folklore, basically found across the world, that man does not. Maybe man has one soul, but often man has multiple souls. One of these souls is much more closely tied to his organic physiology than another. It's called the Po. In China, for instance, I cannot remember the name in. It used to be like bones. I've seen bone soul, but that's a translation, and I can't remember the original term. This soul, when it's thrown out of your body in, say, ritual activity, can take the form of an animal. This is the origin of the popular werewolf. Right? It's not that people turn into a wolf in the folklore. It's that their soul leaves their body in the form of a wolf. The error in understanding here is that in our society, we tend to think of the soul as something insubstantial, whispery, like you can sort of put your hand through it. Ancient societies did not. They tended to think of the soul as something very almost physical. In fact, in many senses, almost coterminous with the physicality. Because I think, somatic. Maybe somatic is a better word rather than bring substance into this. But we see this with the Norse legends of man appearing in the form of a bear to fight in battle. And we also see this with Inuit legends where inanimate objects can take physical form, but it's not that per se that the soul is insubstantial, or the Inua. It's that the Inua is in many sense identical to the physicality. It just manifests weirdly. Weird from the perspective of modern views on how substance operates and then things move in substance. So yeah, this can leave the body. When this occurs during life in the form of an animal, it's a werewolf. But sometimes you die and your double continues to walk. That is a vampire. Did you want to add something, Ryan?
Um, in some cases that's true, although sometimes it you know it yeah it can be the physical body itself that actually is risen, but is because people notice when they go back to the grave, the body is missing, and elsewhere when they return, or when it returns to sleep, then it's back in its grave, and that's the opportune time for you to kill it, is while it's unconscious. I'm not sure with regards to the vampire anything of the sort as a double has been established necessarily. I think you can use the double for vampiric purposes, but I don't know if it's if it's the if the phenomenon of the return of the revenant is something uh, that is the double. I'm not sure if that's what it yields.
So the implication in a lot of, I think, Irish vampire stories is that it is the double, um, which can either haunt man without a body or animate its body and come out of the grave. This is how
Oh,
it shows up in Jeremiah Curtin.
yeah, no, okay, yeah. No, I agree with that. I agree with the animation, yeah.
Yeah. It's not necessary. Sorry for those listening. To clarify, so we can actually identify several different varieties of vampiric spirit, right? The thrust of a vampire is an undead human being that engages in cannibalistic predation, usually at night, upon the living. This allows us to rule out, like, there's a whole bunch of other things that engage in predation on the living, which we might call vampirism, but which are not vampires because they're either not dead. A lot of witchcraft, vampiric witchcraft falls under this label, like the Aswang, see Maximo de Ramos, the Aswang complex, or the Adze, from which I've seen from West Africa, or some of the Iroquois beliefs. And then there's also spirits that are vampiric, but were never human in the first place, and so is no, like, are they dead or not is irrelevant, such as the Roman Strix, the Sumerian Lilitu, possibly still the Aswang. There's a lot of ambiguity there because it's a fairly loose term in Filipino folklore. And then lastly, you have the vampire proper, which is, as I said, when the dead walk and engage in corpse predation. Ryan is correct. This often does take a physical body, but the implication is that it's being animated by the double.
Yeah.
This is implicit in the Irish accounts. It's explicit in our material on Jeongshi.
Yes.
You can see, for those of you wondering, the tales on Jeongshi. Some of them have been translated in Ji-Yun by Ji-Yun and Hongmai. They're some of the most reliable. There are also wonderful instructions and a number of manuals to come out of Taoism. It is, yeah, an animation of the corpse, or corpse, the post soul, lower soul.
Yeah, and
I'm hoping I'm not flipping the Hun and Poe around.
yeah, and I think it's the Pope. It's the Pope.
Mm.
Then you have Terrell Wiley's article on the Rolong, which he wrote, discussing the different kinds of belief in Bonpo Tibetan folk religion concerning the Rolong, which is functionally very similar to the Zhongxi. In fact, it's probably a very East Asian phenomenon that probably made its way either to Tibet via China, perhaps vice versa, but that is almost certainly the same type of creature because like the Zhongxi or Zhongsha, the Rolong can stretch out, or usually does stretch out its arms when trying to attack its victims.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's
yeah. Now, I'm gonna hop into this topic right now because I think this is a good way to segue into it. I think one of the more interesting aspects of the vampiric phenomenon isn't just that vampires. There's this consistent thread of vampirism throughout the world, whether undead, witchcraft, sorcery, or it was never human to begin with. The more undead types, where it once was a living human, but is no longer, and is more just this accursed undead thing. Actually, there is an interesting aspect to this, wherein it can transmit its curse through a touch. Um, this is actually the root of the zombie bite, but also the vampiric or the vampire bite. Because we have this notion in modern culture and modern, fanfare culture, pop culture about, you get bitten by a zombie or a vampire and you start to turn into one. Uh, you know, uh, too many too many pieces of literature and fiction to even name here. I think we all know them, or at least know some of the more popular ones. Um, that motif, for the zombie and the vampire, they share the same folkloric root. And we see this transmission of the undead curse, kind of the namesake for this, this stream's, or, for the stream title, is that it is epidemiological. It spreads. The Zhongxi functions like that. One way, again, there are a couple of ways to create these things according to the folk tradition. It's either through sorcery, or it sometimes it is a soul that kind of like the ghost has unfinished business, or it's just cursed. Um, but then there is the fact that it can actually spread its curse to others just through merely touching.
yeah,
And that's something you see with the Zhongxi, the Rolong. That's something you see in Slavic vampire lore. One particular or specific case of this is the concept of nonicide, or killing of the nine, in kind of East European lore. Now, nine being, of course, a very sacred number and special number for many European religions. Um, the nonicide motif is when a specter, a vampire presumably, it hops on your chest. So it's kind of that, sleep paralysis kind of phenomenon, and it will bite you on the neck. And then when you awake, people can notice sort of like bruises or marks near your neck, or at the base of your neck or anywhere around it. And then soon that person who was bitten dies. Later, once they're buried and what have you, and this goes through nine. So that specter, that vampire, will target nine people. They all die, usually members of the same household, though not always. It could be just members of the community. And then later on, they also start wandering at night after their untimely death, and they also start doing vampiric things. You also have the Draugr in Norse folklore. A lot of people aren't aware. Like everyone, most people, if they're into pop culture or video games, they probably have some rudimentary knowledge on what a Draugr is. Usually, for Norse society, it was conceived as a dead human, right, like an undead, like a ghost, or not actually a ghost, but like the physical dead. It was very physical. It can come back, and we do have Norse burials that attest to this belief and to the phenomenon at wide, um, that you would see in the burials objects placed on certain parts of the body to prevent it from rising. There are also special methods or rituals that would prevent it from rising after the person would die. And this is actually the origin of the stake. The stake was used to actually impale the vampire to the ground so that he couldn't actually escape from his graveyard. Because people would and when it happened, and if you're skeptical of it, then whatever, but in their minds, the corpse would rise physically from the grave and go about killing people. So the way you keep it in the grave is by taking a stake, and then you put it through its body so that it goes through its body and comes out the other end into the ground. So you're actually trying to impale it with the ground so that it stays. And that's where, that's it's one of those anti-undead rituals that you see, almost globally. And they are very ancient. They are very ancient. They actually go back thousands of years.
Yeah,
So this
yeah.
is not a new phenomenon, and you see that with the Draugr. So there are some functional similarities between all these different types of undead. Now, the Draugr, what a lot of people don't know is that it can actually spread its curse by touching. So if it touches you in any way, then you will start to turn into a Draugr yourself, and that's been recorded in Norse sources, or at least that belief on the folk level. So it's pan-European, I would say, but it also stretches into East Asia and elsewhere. So it is very, very interesting, the notion of the undead, which can spread its curse just by touching.
Yeah, so we'll get to the touching again in a moment because I do want to discuss several other alternatives. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, the stake thing, you definitely see that elsewhere. Funnily enough, the garlic belief is quite traditional.
Yes.
Both, I think, Lekuto and I believe Perkowski mention garlic as an effective ward against vampires, which is funny because when I see people trying to write like news articles or whatever on like the lowdown on vampires, that's one of the first things they go after. Where they're like, "No, you can't chase it away with garlic," and I'm like, as far as I'm aware, that's one of the oldest and most consistent. A lot of magical plant stuff. Romans used to chase the Strix away with, was it laurel? It was a twig. They would stick a twig on the door. Um, all I remember is the wood was supposed to be white. Like it was not laurel. They prayed to the. This was where they prayed to Karna, nymph of the door hinges, to do battle with the blood-sucking demons for them. Uh, based Karna, goddess of vampire fighting and door hinges. Uh, but yeah, garlic, the stake, bring it in contact with the earth. I have not read much on Draugr. What's your main source for that, if I can ask?
So there are a couple of sources for that. One was, uh, let's see here. There's the saga of King Hrolf which brings up Draugr.
Mm.
There was, you actually see it, some elements of it, I think, in the Poetic Edda. Um, uh, Claude Lecouteux brings it up in his The Secret History of Vampires.
Oh, I
Yeah,
must have forgotten that one.
yeah.
Or just blended in with vampires.
You see, yeah. I think he also brings it up in his Encyclopedia of Norse
Yes.
and Germanic Folklore.
Yes, he
Uh,
does, but that one's too brief to...
yeah, yeah. Demons and spirits of the land. So Claude really goes into a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and where was I think there was another one here. Uh, hmm. Well, I'll bring it up later when I remember it. But those are where he does definitely bring that up. And yeah,
Okay. Yeah, and Lecouteux is one of our main sources for Europe, alongside Jan L. Perkowski's The Darkling and Daniel Ogden's The Strix Witch. I'm also using a much, much larger collection of regional material that may not go as in depth on and may cover a lot of like I mentioned Maximo de Ramos, the Aswan complex. There's a whole bunch of other works where like vampires are only briefly discussed, but they serve to establish that this is a universal paradigm. For instance, Bastien and Winfield's Iroquois Supernatural, which, in spite of the awful name, thank you, Inner Traditions, has a pretty good handling of sources. Uh, the ancient gods and symbols of, or sorry, the gods and symbols of ancient Mexico and the Maya also repeat a lot of what Ryan just said about the Aztec folklore and Aztec belief in certain vampiric spirits. Um, yeah, those are the main ones. There's a whole bunch of the other, I guess, smaller ones that maybe won't necessarily come up. But I'm just going to push or discuss, narrow in on the transmission issue. So it's a vampire, undead human, engages in cannibalism. Uh, Sometimes is just the dead soul clinging into the body. Sometimes is the animated by a sorcerer. This shows up consistently globally. Um, and this can be distinguished from sort of other types of vampiric but not vampire activity, such as, I mean, a lot of demons, just a lot of like Strix Lilitu, some Aswang encounters. But then I would also like to note that there's an entire large category of witchcraft that seems to pass on the same way. Um, well, yeah, some encounters involving the Aswang or Manananggal uh, in the Far East, and then I guess still in the East, but closer to Europe. You have some Indian accounts about the Anangu that I read in. I'm actually not too fond of that source, but that's mostly because they're very liberal and keep making snide remarks. Um, but yeah, Gods and Demons of India by Bhairav.
and I did find one of my sources. It was from Armand Jacobson's uh, article about the Fearless Vampire Killer.
This is paranormal discussion.
Yeah.
But if you want to get anything out of this for D&D, like I use accurate folklore in my Dungeons and Dragons games. Well, theology. I suppose we could get theology out of this. I actually, yeah, because we can sort of. I mean, it would be a bit of a divergence, but yeah, it does show up in theology because vampires have long been used as a sort of inverse paradigm for Jesus. Uh, like Jesus dies on the cross to redeem us and bring us to life, and through dying with him, we are brought to life. Whereas the vampire is like it's the exact opposite, right? It dies, but it refuses. It continues to maintain a horrifying half-life through bringing others into death with it.
Not to mention, it sustains its own life at the expense of others.
Yeah, yeah. And this is old. This goes back to, I didn't want to discuss Nephilim too much today. I want to do a special lecture, but the Nephilim were vampiric.
Yes.
They were, of course, were not quite human because they were half angelic. But ancient accounts on the Nephilim also, or ancient, late antique. So we're talking here about a lot of Manichaean sources, a lot of late Jewish sources. To be fair, like going all the way back to Qumran, so pre-Christian, do describe the Nephilim as, in some cases, paradigmatic vampires, spirits of the dead that continue to survive through preying on the living. To defy God? If you want to defy the created order, maybe. So, way back at the start of this video, which I'm not sure you were here for, I spoke about the 5th century boxer Euthymus of Locri. Euthymus of Locri won gold at the Olympics twice in boxing, and is best known for having encountered a hero to whom the local village... No, don't worry about it. Well, people come in when they come in, right? That's perfectly fine. Euthymus of Locri is best known for having battled a hero that was demanding sacrifices of beautiful maidens, which it was eating to continue its own existence. Eating does not necessarily mean literally eating. It could mean draining of energy or lifeblood. Euthymus battled the hero, exorcised it, and married the woman. And then the account goes that he became a god. But that's not necessarily at the same time. That's just the Greeks. And then he became a god, adding that onto the end. So in context, I mean, we say hero and you're like, talk, because we tend, for us, a hero is just, what you call, like somebody who sacrifices his life for others through his own greatness of soul. To the ancient Greeks, hero had a very different meaning. It referred to a deified human being, a sort of demigod who was worshipped at certain ritual sites. And sometimes these were very sincere rituals, to just not to insult ancient polytheism unduly, but sometimes these were, as the ancient polytheists themselves acknowledged, very demonic. The second century sage Plotinus, or I guess he's 3rd century, 2nd or 3rd century Platonic philosopher and magician Plotinus infamously refused to pray at hero shrines because he thought they were diamonds that survived on the sacrifices of mortals. Usually, of course, these were just offerings, but in some cases they were actual human beings. So Philostratus, who predates Plotinus by about half a century, in his Heroicus is talking about the afterlives of the great heroes, and he has a fascinating story about Achilles. So a merchant had stopped at the island on which Achilles was buried, and he was surprised enough to meet Achilles. And him and Achilles went drinking. This is the spirit of Achilles to be. But again, remembering that to the ancients, the soul could take it had a somatic existence or physical existence. Maybe not physical in substance the way we would think of it, but like it was just as present as any human being, or any living human being, excuse me. Which I think actually, to return to Slavic vampires complicates discussion of the body significantly. But anyway, Achilles, he asks for a disciple or for a descendant of, I want to say Helen, but it could have been another woman of Troy, because he tells the merchant he wants to marry her. Merchant is delighted that the two are finally settling their ancient feud, finds out, procures the woman, convinces her to come and marry Achilles, brings her. Achilles thanks the merchant, and as the merchant is sailing away from the island, he is horrified to see Achilles rip the woman apart with his bare hands. And basically subsist on her. Bearing in mind, so this is Philostratus the Heroicus. I believe this account is repeated in Hansen's book of Roman and Greek folklore. I could be wrong. I read it in the initial account. But this does emphasize that the sort of ancient cult of the heroes, which was practically identical to the Nephilim, was often, not always, to be very clear here, not always, maybe not even most of the time, but often was associated with, what we would call vampirism. Undead, they are the humans subsisting after the grave on the souls of the living, or bodies, of the living, to perpetuate itself. I don't think the connection to Jesus in that sense is all that arbitrary on the part, like sometimes the parallels Christian theologians make are very forced. In the case of the vampire, I think it follows pretty naturally, especially since this distinction was made by ancient Jewish Christian Manichaean writers themselves. And the Taoists, too, funnily enough. It's often compared, like the fear of death is often blamed in some Taoist and Buddhist writings for the manifestation of afterlife vampirism. And you actually need to conquer your fear of death to conquer death. So even the Jiangshi in an emic or internal context, not all that not seen as theologically or theologically equated to the life of the Taoist immortal or saint, or theologically contrasted with the life of the Bodhisattva / Taoist immortal Jian. Okay, so thank you for the Armin Jacobson citation. Fearless vampire killers, a note about the Icelandic Draugr and demonic contamination in Grettis Saga. And it is interesting that you got this from Armin Jacobson, because I've read some other articles by him, and I found him to be fairly willing to rewrite Icelandic folklore in some cases to support liberal preconceptions.
Oh, I've read some of his other stuff, like on dwarves. There's a lot to be desired. However, I actually did enjoy this article.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, he wrote the last time I read him, it was a very weird article that tried to use the fact correspondence between the word, like the use of the word black, to argue that because that the Iceland view in some Icelandic sagas that demons took a black form meant that they were talking about like evil Ethiopians from beyond the grave. No, it means black, like in the sense of pitch black. The fact that it was later applied to Ethiopians is just a linguistic feature. It's not that they thought that it was identical to demons. But don't let that stop you, good sir. So that is it. Anywho, but returning to vampires. I would like to
remember correctly, I think he was the one who tried to argue that belief in dwarves and giants was akin to our belief in Neanderthals, or like from some anthropological, psychological perspective. I just thought that was kind of hilarious. It's like,
to be fair, that's a very, very traditional Victorian argument.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, very traditional. It's just Neanderthals. Mind you, you can also talk. There has been compelling literature pointing out how much of science, the popular science, is just folklore. And how much of that folklore sometimes then goes on to inform science when it comes to discussion of like ancient hominids or the dinosaurs or evolution. So there is but it's a separate conversation, so we maybe don't want to get too off track there.
Right.
So I'm going to go back to so yeah, as I mentioned, and we mentioned sort of three types of vampires when we started. The undead, which is the literal strict meaning, like the Slavic term vampire refers to the undead rather than to demonic encounters or to witchcraft, which are the other two. Laying aside demons, there are instances of transmission of vampirism with witchcraft from some of the Southeast Asian and some of the North American folklore, where the Manananggal / Aswang bites you, and then if it doesn't kill you, you take up a life as an Aswang yourself.
It's also Icelandic.
Oh yeah,
Like the connection with sorcery. It's mentioned briefly in the Hrolfkraki saga when the half-elf Skuld is kind of blamed for resurrecting Draugr during the battle. And while that's like a very late Icelandic view on the phenomenon, I would say it does have its precursors.
oh yeah. I'm
And
just
it does
sort
have
of,
yeah.
mind you, that doesn't necessarily establish too much, because we did start this lecture by pointing out that the vampire is not an extreme departure from other aspects of like what we might call as the folkloric worldview. Rather, it's a continuation of those aspects into the afterlife.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So a lot of features of witchcraft and werewolfism show up. I mean, it makes sense. Like it's totally rational from the perspective of somebody who believes in a double or powerful energies in the human body, to think that those might continue after you die to animate the corpse.
Yeah.
It just maybe, yeah, like from our perspective, are real. Or the modern, perspective of things that are real is like, well, why would you believe that?
And necromancy would just be the art of knowing how to do that yourself.
Yeah. Well, yeah, often with the soul. Necromancy, that's a separate, very interesting question, or separate discussion, because necromancy, it's used in respect to a lot, like anything to do with the undead, but that also means it tends to get brought into like ancestor worship, which is very different.
I agree.
But then you still do see with like controlling the soul from beyond the grave. How much
I mean,
of you?
I would define it as like a conscious manipulation of the dead.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the Chinese understanding. How much have you read on the Haitian zombie, which for those who are just joining is a vampire?
Yeah, I remember that one book that talked about it. It went over how belief in zombies in Haiti was very real, very imminent, and it was basically a servitor or a corpse that was risen or resurrected through magic by the sorcerer, I think, hoodoo, whatever, priest, and he could send it to do his bidding. But the book reached the conclusion that zombies were just people on drugs.
Yeah, that was the one I was thinking. That's the only other, and that's my issue, is I think it can reasonably establish it's a type of vampire, but my problem is the only literature I've read on the zombie, the actual zombie, not like the Walking Dead TV series. The only literature I've read has had a very idiosyncratic approach. And the problem with, at the start of this video, for those who joined, we explained our methodology, and I noted that we prefer to look at the precise features of the account and then seek to interpret them rather than provide our own interpretations. Part of the reason we do that is when scholars decide they don't want to do that and start rewriting terms or meaning, it can often occlude what's actually going on, or what people think is going on. And like the other sources I've read sort of talked about a psychic zombie from Haiti that's just the spirit. But I actually was not sure if that was an actual thing they were describing, or if they were just conflating voodoo ancestor worship with summoning the undead. With the salient difference, for the record, being vampires are typically not intelligent. Some exceptions, but as that aside, it was one of the things we should have mentioned earlier. Like the image of the vampire as an intelligent person who will hold like a 6-hour conversation with you is, as far as I'm aware, mostly a feature of literature. I've read a couple accounts where it talks. Usually, it's just a blind monster driven by hunger. Does that match your perception, Ryan?
Well, Claude brings up the phenomenon of the revenant, which can actually like eat and dance and hold conversation, but eventually returns to its grave and might
actually,
slave.
Actually, yeah, I should have remembered that, because Parkowski talks about vampires having the Serbian belief that you can continue to belief from Serbia, probably not current today, but the traditional Serbian view that you can sleep with a vampire and produce viable offspring.
Yes.
Which actually is not the weirdest belief associated with vampires.
No.
So yeah, maybe we shouldn't.
I was just that does get a bit ambiguous, because when the vampire decides to do that, it might take on. There's this notion that the vampire monster might also take on the visage or the visage of your like husband, or just your husband if you're a woman, and then sleep with you and produce a baby, because that also overlaps with what we might think of as fairies. So there's some ambiguity there sometimes, but yeah, no.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's true. Would help if more of the original sources were translated out of the Latin.
Yeah.
Easier to cross. But yeah, another good example of what I mentioned of interpretation can sometimes occlude a proper analysis. A lot of clerical views, clerical interpretations, rewriting fairies as one creature or another. Sometimes that's not necessarily wrong, but often it leads to a lot of weirdness. A lot of the stuff about Diana that you encounter in modern neo-pagan circles goes back to Dominicans aggressively replacing references to a very specific type of fairy maiden with the goddess Diana.
Yeah.
And then early Victorian historians were either not aware or uncaring of the practice of Christian clerics of like providing rewrites or like rewritten terms for these figures, and this led to early neo-pagan writers going, well, clearly Diana was still being worshipped in wide parts of medieval Europe, which is not true. Yeah, all my homies hate the Dominican. Yeah, not Diana. I mean, maybe there was some person worshiping Diana, but generally it is very frivolous, especially in Germany where Diana was just never worshipped, to assume that.
Yeah. Totes Diana, guys, come on.
Totes Diana. Yeah, actually, it was a fairy maiden. Frau Perkt was one of the regional Frau Halle.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we have a bunch of other names. we may not actually know a lot. We don't actually know what a lot of them were because, of course, what we have are the Dominicans or other clerics writing. But yeah, we have this feature of transmission. Yeah, I should have remembered the dancing vampire. The only one I was able to remember was Jeremiah Curtin's story of the Irish vampire, which used to request people give it a ride to and from the graveyard, so it could commit its depredations because it didn't have legs, or it couldn't bend its legs. I love folklore.
Was that the Irish one?
This is an Irish account, yeah.
Huh. The ability to, or the non-ability to not be able to bend that's very Rolongish.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was because it couldn't bend the legs or if because something had happened to the legs and they were now gone. But whatever it was immobile, and so it kept requesting that people take it out of the grave so it could go about eating. Okay. Yeah.
Help a vampire out.
Help a vampire out. I should have reread that one because Curtin also had an account involving I'm wondering if that was the one that was fastidious and would only eat people who didn't keep their houses clean. Or if it was a different account.
We need to lobby for vampire welfare. Come on.
Vampire welfare. Yeah, legendary. You do encounter this stuff in the margins of folklore. People tend to for those who don't read a lot of folklore accounts, people tend to focus on the stuff that's super meaningful. Weirdly enough, especially atheist exegetes, right? Will narrow in on like the stuff that was used to found religions or to derive great metaphysical teachings. A lot of folklore, on the other hand, is just weird and stupid, and we have no idea why it's there. Other than that, like people were like, "Oh, this is hilarious! I better keep telling this to my descendants." I have a video on this account of tales about the Selkies. Several such like examples of the Selkies talking. I don't think I recorded the one where the Selkie agrees to take a man to the country fair because it was planning to go out for a drink anyways. It's like, I'll take you across the loch, but you need to agree to take me to the local bar. Pay for my tab. And then it's like the guy's descendants swear this can't possibly have happened, but we think this is too stupid not to be real, is what the informant told the guy taking the child out.
That's funny.
He's like, the very fact that this was absurd testifies to Dave Thompson's The People of the Sea. Beautiful book, beautiful. Like generally really well written book and very funny in places. But yeah, undead, flesh eating, sometimes literate, sometimes verbal. I still think it's safe to say usually not.
Usually not, yeah.
Yeah, usually not. There are sub-sectors there. There is a consistent belief that children who are aborted will return to haunt their community in revenge. This shows up in Romania, in Sieperkowski, in Iceland. I cannot remember my source off the top of my head. I know which book it is. I can't remember the name, and it also shows up. It's called an Angiak amongst the Greenlandic and Canadian Inuit, and you would bring a shaman in to. Usually, you would get the person in question to confess before it consumed the community. But yeah, that's a good example of a a separate a subspecies of vampire, but yeah, undead, not intelligent. My source there was Arngrimr's Sigurðsson, Museum of Hidden Beings. It's not an academic source or not a great source on its own, except for the fact that he's drawing from actual sources, mostly Armin Jacobson. Actually, mostly Armin Jacobson. Yeah, that one shows up in The Witcher. It shows up in The Witcher, but it has a series of and The Witcher, very, I don't want to say folklorically accurate, but drew heavily from folklore, and drawing from, as I said, the Icelandic. In Iceland, it showed up as a raven with, I want to say, a human skull, and would screech. In Romania, it would go after its birth mother and seek to devour her. And in the Inuit, it would just go after whoever. So yeah. Tell that next time you hear somebody talking about all the babies up in heaven, it's all the babies preying on human flesh. And then we have then things that are vampiric, but as I said, they're not undead. Sometimes they're not human, but often it's the result of witchcraft, and it's the same sort of process as the vampire, but done consciously while alive. And you always know you're dealing with one of those because there's a feminist journal named after it. It's like every time you read about a horrible blood-sucking demon and you're like, oh god, this is awful, it's like also the name of a local feminist literary magazine. Anangu Tlahopuchi Susayant, Aswang. It's like, oh lord. Oh lord. But yeah. I think that is that any other features of the vampire?
We could go over methods of dispatching it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess a common method really is sometimes there are cases where exorcism works, but sometimes there are cases where it does not. And it does actually have to be slain rather violently. So that usually involves a chop to the head. In the case of the roll long, you actually have to hit it on a certain part of its body because it will have a weakness there. And that is a very folkloric theme, which is sort of the weak part of the folkloric entity in question. So there are some themes there, like an Achilles heel kind of motif, and that in itself is a motif. But we won't get into that tonight. So there's the head. Usually, that's what I see. You have to decapitate it. But there are also instances, I think, in the case of like Inuit. These aren't vampires, but they're undead. The Tupilat, I think it's called. It can be, because that one is created by a sorcerer. That one can be kind of sent back to its maker, and then it'll kill it. Which you see a lot in witchcraft, which is send back to maker.
Yeah.
To get rid of the curse.
Yeah,
but you have to kill it violently.
Yeah, that one is old for the belief that you can send a curse back on the witch and that this will kill the witch is the oldest belief associated with witchcraft. The earliest account goes all the way back to the witchcraft, so called the Maklu witchcraft rites, which were Akkadian, sometime in the second millennium BCE, or BC, sorry. See Svea Bush's The Witchcraft series Maklu for a translation of that one. That one also has most of the features of the modern vampire encounter in it. It's just too poorly understood and fragmentary for us to make definitive claims based on it. Although I have been given to understand. Have you seen anyone vet Summers? Actually, Sorry, did you read Irving Finkel's book on Sumerian ghosts?
I have it on my Kindle, but I never got around to it yet.
Okay, I haven't read it either. It's on my to-read list. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is Montague Summers argues the vampire goes back to ancient Sumer. And I know, and then he lists a spirit or a name, and I know that Finkel talks about that, but I don't know what he has to say on it. And obviously, Finkel is going to be much more accurate than Summers.
Yeah.
Not because of any, just because of major advances in Mesopotamian archaeology since Summers' death.
Well, and Summers wasn't even specialized in that field.
Yeah, Summers was. I mean, he was a Latin. Yeah, I think he spoke Latin, maybe. But yeah, Summers not specialized in Assyriology, and huge advances made. I will have to get back to you. Possible the whole vampire conflicts goes all the way back to Sumeria.
Mm-hmm.
Although I will take this instance to note, this is a quick methodology note. One of the very naive assumptions, one of the assumptions people tend to make when they get started in folkloristics and paranormal phenomena and ancient poobab is they think the literary record it represents the transmission of the beliefs. So they'll say, because we have the witchcraft series Maklu that I just mentioned, therefore witchcraft rites go back to that rite. That is actually, it's important to remember that all records of magic rites or folk, like including first-hand records, like descriptions on how to perform the rite, but also descriptions of the rite, and even just pieces of folklore, are instances of beliefs that already existed. The first literary recording is not going to be when the belief got started. By the time that was there, the belief will usually have been around for centuries, and might. In this case, we can talk about the spread of beliefs. There's a method for charting that. You can find the full explanation in Alan Dunn's International Folkloristics. This is the method of von Sydow, and we can roughly trace folklore, how folkloric tales pass. It takes a while, but suffice it to say that when I say the oldest record in the Sumerian series is in, the Akkadian witchcraft rites, that establishes nothing as to its age. It simply establishes that we're not dealing with something more recent.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. It also does not establish, say, that, like, I mean, it would be really weird to, obviously, Native American witchcraft rites that are similar to the Sumerian one I just described cannot have come from ancient Sumer. That's maybe not totally impossible, because there is slightly better evidence but there is pretty good evidence that people got around more often than is generally assumed. But it's pretty unlikely. But it's also equally improbable that similarities to, say, African witchcraft beliefs, which again, very similar, even today. I cannot remember his name. He's the famous researcher on Congolese witchcraft. Was it the one who detransitioned?
Oh. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
I forget his name, but I know who you're talking about.
Anyway, many of the beliefs we've discussed, he's tracked in the modern-day Congo. Oh god, this is going to bug me. It's like all I remember about the dude is his entire family was like horribly murdered in suspicious circumstances. He worked on the British Occult Crimes Division, and he transitioned and then detransitioned. He is the correct pronoun for the moment. I cannot remember.
Yeah, he was given like an African ritual mask that gave him nightmares. It smelled like saffron or cinnamon or something, or like some spice. It was interesting. I want to find that mask.
Yeah, but yeah. In this case, of course, this is well after colonialism, And there is an active discussion as to how much Christianity has changed African beliefs on magic. Although I think the ultra liberal position that like they were just added by Christians is pretty clearly absurd. Archaeology would be sufficient to reject that, since we do have records of a lot of magical apparatus from the Congo going back to well before Christians were ever there. But yeah, my only point here is if the belief it was found in the Congo before Christians arrived, it cannot have come from the Sumerian work. It's just weird and frivolous. It's more likely, assuming the belief was passed down and is not the result of an actual encounter with witches, it would have had to have been passed down far earlier than that by traveling tribes, bands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find the belief on. I know what I know the article. I just can't remember its name on. That's okay. We'll just.
I found out who it was. The guy, Richard Hoskins.
Richard Hockey, thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I cannot remember where did I post the articles? Somewhere I did post articles on Congolese witchcraft proving that they are pre-European. And I even mentioned it because there's an ongoing dispute. A lot of non-European peoples describe the other beings from the other world as being white. They mean white in the pure sense, like the actual color white, not like tan-skinned. Academics don't like this. They keep arguing it's a post-Christian imposition of colonialism. And I remember sending you these articles, and I cannot remember where I sent them, or what their names were, because the articles mentioned that we have reliefs from like the 12th century showing spirits from the other world as white.
Yeah.
Like the literally white, not pinkish or whatever. Like,
well, we're not talking about like Caucasian skin tone.
Yes, we are talking about actual pure white beings.
And
you can even see this if any of you do. I know we mentioned I'm not really going to rely on literature, but if any of you did want to read literature, you can read Arthur Macken's The White People. I believe I've mentioned it before on this channel. I really love his discussion of the nature of evil. And again, it's the evil in question is not, not the evil. The white people in question are not like, he's not talking about Caucasians from beyond the grave. He's talking about pure white spirits, which is mostly peripheral to our discussion, except as it informs my point about how ancestor worship is not necromancy.
Yeah.
Because you would not be emphasizing the, purity. I mean, among other reasons, white, symbolizes purity of the people you're looking at, unless you sincerely believed them to be not be demonic in the way that vampires are. Which people are welcome to disagree with if they do think ancestor worship is bad, but let's at least be honest about the distinction in the mind of people who engage in these practices, right?
Yeah. I actually did want to mention earlier that returning to our earlier conversation about how to kill vampires, That will also depend on your culture and the way you actually the way you depose human remains. Because I've discussed before how, like, in Christian Europe, they would like chop off the head or do something similar or just stake it so it doesn't come out of the ground. But in ancient Greece, for example, they would act like the Lamia vampire, which is a very similar type of being, would actually be cremated, would be burnt. And that was sort of more acceptable regarding burial customs. But yeah, that is a method of dispatching. Um, and yeah, I think when it comes to dating things like the vampire belief and sorcery and its relation to sorcery or witchcraft or whatever, I think I would say it is prehistoric, um, or pre literacy, um, because we do have examples going back like 12,000 years, archaeological examples of what you might call aberrant or unusual burials, where you have objects placed on certain, like very heavy objects like rocks, placed on different parts of the body, strange parts of the body. So I think in terms of dating this belief, it's just impossible.
Yeah, I'm on yeah part. We talk about sometimes people try to focus on like interaction between humans. I mentioned the colonists.
Mm.
Um, that is going to especially show up when we start looking at the fact that the Oswong complex, for instance, shows up amongst the Aztecs. And yet the chances of Filipinos and Aztecs communicating by boat is rather unlikely, um, which raises the question of why they held identical views on certain groups of blood-sucking female witches. Separate the top of the body separates from the bottom at night to go drinking blood. Um, as I said, shows up amongst the Aztecs, shows up amongst other Nahuatl peoples, also shows up in like the Philippines and India. We can talk reasonably about transmission from the Philippines to India. We cannot reasonably talk about transmission from the Philippines to the Aztecs. So this is where you tend to see academics. I mean, in this case, they can't even invoke colonialism. They cannot invoke because this is before. Problem with this one is we have the archaeological remnants, not of the vampires, of Aztec wards against the vampires and depictions of what they thought the vampires looked like. But yeah, they'll try to explain transmission. Sometimes they focus on the literary transmission method has been out of fashion since the Victorian era, because it was proven to be pretty stupid, for lack of a better word. Sometimes they do try and talk about verbal transmission and how we can detect the traces in the written and archaeological records, but these are maps of a much broader spread of active and passive transmitters. This is going to be more accurate. But when it comes to a lot of magical beliefs, a lot of them are primordial. Which raises a number of questions about their consistency across history. Since we're talking about dozens of cultures from multiple continents preserving the exact same belief if we assume it was transmission for 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 years, whereas if we think that these are encounters with real beings, then all of that issue goes away. But I'll not depend on hypothesis and simply note that transmission tends to be remarkably consistent across geographic areas, with most differences tending to be von Sydow describes what he calls oikotypes, which is the changes in the same belief that occur from region to region as the belief gets adapted to the culture in question, while the essence of the belief remains the same. So the vampire is universal. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's global. Maybe hasn't been believed by everyone at all times in all places, but it's been believed on every continent throughout most of history, and in spite of today's secularism, will probably be believed by our descendants. Especially some of that stuff about fetuses returning from the grave, cut off before their time. But yeah, global. So maybe not universal, but global. And then the core features have been consistent, and the differences have tended to be like which plant are you going to use to get rid of it, the features of the chant that you invoke. That's all oikotypal. Can it walk normally, or does it hop? Right, that's an oikotypal difference. In China, it hops, and Tibet, but I think the Tibetan account. I hold the idiosyncratic view that Tibet is more dependent on China than most people think, for a lot of its supernatural beliefs.
Right.
Which tends to be contrary to how it's presented in sources. But if you look at time scale, the Chinese is usually earlier. But yeah, Chinese Zhongshi and the Tibetan, you said Rolong?
The Rolong, yeah, the Rolong.
Yeah, he's the one who knows more about Tibet on this instance than I do.
Well, it shambles. I think it shambles, yeah. It just can't bend down because its knees are jank.
Yeah. Whereas as I have not seen that feature show up in Slavic accounts.
No. But you could see the epidemiology, though. Like the epidemic part, we'll call it the
virulence.
Yeah,
that's consistent. This could also have to do with class. In Europe, from an early period, folklore was the province of the peasantry. Not that the elite didn't believe in a lot of this stuff, but they tended to have their own preconceived opinions on it. This is still true today, right? In China, on the other hand, of supernatural monsters was considered. Earlier I cited some Jiangxi stories from Ji Yun. He's one of our best sources from the Qing dynasty. Ji Yun was the grand librarian of the Qing dynasty. He held a position in China equivalent to, if not greater than, Benjamin Franklin. At the same time, like the two are contemporaries of each other. And yet, like, Benjamin Franklin was just a hardline deist who would never have believed in any supernatural spirits. Except maybe God. Not God is not a spirit, excuse me. And Ji Yun is best known he's best known today for A, having compiled the longest encyclopedia in history, and B, for having written collected 10 volumes of supernatural stories from his friends and acquaintances. So he's like, yep, this is the number one. This story about this giant floating baby head must be passed down to posterity. But this is a huge difference in attitude. I'm not going to say between East and West because I don't like that. I think that's an outmoded idea. But certainly between like the Chinese intelligentsia's attitude of the spiritual world versus the Western intelligentsia's attitude, the European, intelligentsia's attitude. Obviously not at all times and in all places. Certainly medievals were much more open to this topic. There is a lovely little book by David Shiovitz on Jewish and Christian intellectuals' attitudes to all sorts of werewolves and flying camels, and I think he even discusses vampires. Because they do show up in at least one passage, or if not two, in the Sefer Hasidim, which is a 13th century Jewish book of religious advice that contains a great deal of information on how to do battle with werewolves. Always a pressing social need. The vampiric material hasn't been as well covered in English, unfortunately, which is why I didn't cite it too much. The werewolf material, for those who are interested, there's a lecture by the late Rabbi Zechariah Wallerstein Zeitel on how to do battle with a werewolf per Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, who claims firsthand experience for his writing, which again is memorate to legend, right? Eliezer of Worms gives a memorate. Actually, yeah, we can actually talk about memorates and like how real life encounters then become folklore. I think was it Moses Gaster who thought several tales of Eliezer of Worms as to the supernatural. Eliezer of Worms was a 13th century Jewish rabbi, very learned, wrote on a number of theological and philosophical issues. Is best known today for having written on like how to make golems fight werewolves and soar into the highest heavens. So very involved in Merkava mysticism. Wrote one of the last editions, commentaries on a book of the Enochic material on Judaism, or Metatron, sorry. Hilchot Metatron. And several of those stories then show up in later Yiddish fiction. Like I believe I've read or Goster comments that a couple of them show up in the Masa book, for instance, but in very heavily dramatized form, where Eliezer like turns into a werewolf himself. I could be getting the Yiddish book. There's a lot of Yiddish folklore out there, and I might have confused Gaster with New Greuschel. Because I was not planning to discuss Jewish werewolf lore going into this. But yes, yeah, vampires, like, they were a subject of scholarly discussion in medieval Europe. This fell out of fashion in the early modern period when it became accustomed to just dismiss such things with obviously important major and worthy exceptions. One of these days, I would like to discuss. His name just flew out of my head. Not Schelling. Eschenmayer, the German idealist Eschenmayer, who attempted to imply Schellingian nature philosophy to how to control people's energy with magic powers and dowsing. Which Hegel then drew on. But a totally random tangent. Back to vampires. So, we briefly provided a definition. We indicated the scope. We discussed how to get rid of it. I'm not going to discuss how to create one. I'm sorry. You can hunt our sources down and find that out for yourself if you really want to make a vampire. Or just wander around a graveyard at night, wait to get bitten. Nom 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 nom. Yeah, anything else you want to add, Ryan?
No, I think that about covers it.
Beautiful. So that has been vampires. I think that was very all over the place. But that's okay, because this was more of a discussion than a revealing to you the truth about vampires. And our real goal, of course, was methodology.
Yeah.
Because then you can take the methodological notes and apply them like to giant encounters, right?
Yes.
Or fairy lore or werewolfism. So it's methodology. Methodology helps you think about the world. Helps you learn about it much better than actually vampires were a metaphor for the white man's social anxiety over his inegalitarian circumstances. Well, that's in Marx.
Oh wow.
Sort of. I'm sardonically amending it, but Marx is the first major analyst of. I may be confusing him with a later Marxist. I believe he talked about it himself, actually. how the vampire is a noble figure because it's a representative of the bourgeois fear of how the capitalist class leeches off of them.
Okay.
This is a mistake based on his conflating the folklore with the literature.
I see.
Yeah. Vampires and folklore are just any person, right? Does not discriminate by class, does not discriminate male, but doesn't discriminate by gender. At least for the undead ones. Different topic for the blood-sucking witches. And it's in literature, but that is because the has less to do with capitalism and has more to do with actually probably bourgeois admiration almost of social custom of the gentility. Chesterton complained about this, that like a lot of penny dreadful literature in his time portrayed portrayed the aristocracy as being dashing in their mannerisms and like full of eloquence and grace, which he said was a load of hog. Like he said, if there's anything the intelligent, it's not the intelligence. If there's anything the nobility, it's dashing and full of wit. But yeah, I think that had more to do with why the vampire became like sort of transformed into a tragic figure of the gentility. Austen makes a similar complaint to Chesterton in Northanger Abbey, and this is before Marx. Anywho, this has been Wild Philosopher and Ryan. I will try to do something next Thursday. Maybe it won't be with Ryan. If it is, we might be doing another supernatural topic. If it isn't, I might be discussing why I want to do a video on why identity isn't what you think it is, or rather, why there are actually a dozen different notions of identity being used in the media and willfully equivocated. But yeah, we'll keep you up to date on that. And this Sunday, I will be meeting with Matt Krotz, who I've been on his channel. I don't think he's been on mine yet. We will be meeting to discuss the trendification of society and how this threatens a common ground to relate to each other. So yeah, thank you very much. It's been Wild Philosophy. Wishing you all a wonderful day.
And yeah, it's been nice. Thanks for having me on again. I look forward to the next session. Ryan Rose out.